Have you ever seen a face so familiar it stops your heart? For one couple, a single photograph in an adoption database did just that. It showed a little boy who was the spitting image of the husband, a child they'd never met. They thought it was a sign, a miracle after years of pain. But they had no idea that this child was not a coincidence, but a ghost from a past the husband had tried to bury forever. What they uncovered would not only give them the family they always dreamed of, but would also solve a painful mystery that had haunted them for decades. Get ready for a story that proves family finds you, even across time and tragedy. Emily and Ethan were a picture of suburban Chicago life. They met at a friend's 4th of July barbecue, bonding over a shared love for old movies and a mutual disdain for ketchup on hot dogs. Emily, an elementary school teacher with a warmth that could melt a Chicago winter, saw a deep kindness in Ethan's quiet eyes. Ethan, a civil engineer who built bridges for a living, felt like he'd finally found his anchor in her easy laugh. Their life was built on simple dreams: a small bungalow in Berwyn, weekend trips to Lake Michigan, and the echoing laughter of children in their backyard. But after 7 years of marriage, their cosy home remained silent. The room they had painted a hopeful, sunny yellow, intended to be a nursery, stood empty. It served as a constant, painful reminder of the one dream that remained agonizingly out of reach, a dream that was slowly starting to tear them apart at the seams. The fluorescent lights of the bathroom hummed, an indifferent buzz in the crushing silence. Emily stared at the small plastic stick in her trembling hand. A single, stark, pink line. Again, it was the 5th and final round of IVF. The last of their savings, the last of their hope, all gone. A sob caught in her throat, a ragged, ugly sound. She slid down the cool tile wall, burying her face in her knees. It wasn't just the absence of a baby. It was the feeling of her own body betraying her, month after month, year after year. The scent of bleach and lavender air freshener filled her senses, a sterile smell for a sterile womb. When Ethan found her, he didn't speak. He just knelt beside her, his large, calloused hand gently rubbing her back. His silence was its own language, a shared vocabulary of grief they had become fluent in. He felt the tremors of her weeping through the floor, a helpless architect watching the foundations of their shared world crack. Their story had begun so differently, filled with the easy optimism of new love. That barbecue in a Lincoln Park backyard felt like a lifetime ago. The air smelled of charcoal and freshly cut grass. Ethan, usually reserved, had found himself drawn to Emily's bright, animated storytelling as she described a disastrous second-grade science fair project. He'd noticed the way she tucked a stray strand of blonde hair behind her ear, the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled. For him, it was like a switch had been flipped. For her, his steady presence was a calm harbour. They talked for hours as the sun set behind the city skyline, discovering they both grew up in working-class families, both were the first to get a college degree, and both believed that kindness was a currency more valuable than money. It was a simple, uncomplicated beginning to what they believed would be a simple, uncomplicated life together. A promise whispered over lukewarm beers and the distant pop of fireworks. Emily's childhood was modest but filled with a fierce, unwavering love. Raised by a single mother, a nurse who worked double shifts at Cook County Hospital, she never felt a lack of anything important. Their small apartment was a sanctuary of support and encouragement. Her mother, Carol, was her biggest champion, the one who stayed up late helping with homework and packed her lunch with little encouraging notes. Ethan's past, however, was a locked room he rarely opened. He spoke of it in vague, clipped sentences. A rough neighbourhood, a mother who struggled. He'd mentioned working odd jobs since he was a teenager, stocking shelves, bussing tables, to pay his own way. Emily sensed a deep well of pain behind his guarded words, a story of survival he wasn't ready to share. She respected his silence, assuming that their future happiness would eventually heal whatever wounds his past had inflicted. She didn't know the wound wasn't a scar. It was an open, gaping loss he carried every single day. Years spun by, marked by a calendar of ovulation cycles and doctor's appointments. Their life became a series of 2-week waits, of hushed phone calls from the fertility clinic, of shared glances that held more despair than hope. The financial burden was a constant pressure, a mountain of debt growing with every failed procedure. One evening, after another devastating phone call from the doctor, Ethan found Emily staring blankly at the empty nursery. "Em," he said softly, "maybe we should think about other options. Adoption." Emily flinched as if struck. "No," she whispered, her voice sharp with pain. "I don't want a stranger's child, Ethan. I want our child. I want to see you in their eyes, or me in their smile." The words hung in the air, a cruel wall between them. He wanted to be a father. She wanted to be a mother to a child of their own blood. It was the first time their dreams had diverged, creating a chasm of misunderstanding that felt terrifyingly wide. Months later, the house had settled into a fragile truce. The topic of children was avoided, a landmine in the landscape of their marriage. Emily had given up. She had accepted her fate. One rainy Tuesday, while her third graders were at gym, she found herself scrolling through the Illinois State Adoption Portal. It was a form of morbid curiosity, a way to gaze into the life she would never have. She clicked through photos of smiling children with hopeful eyes, each one a pang in her chest. She felt a profound sadness for them, but no connection. They were all beautiful, but they were all strangers. Then she saw him, a 6-year-old boy named Leo. The photo was a simple school picture, slightly out of focus. But Emily's breath hitched in her chest. Her coffee mug slipped from her hand, shattering on the classroom floor. She was looking at a ghost. She was looking at a photograph of her husband as a little boy. The resemblance was supernatural. It wasn't just a passing similarity. It was an exact replica. The same wide-set, serious grey-green eyes, the same stubborn cowlick in his chestnut hair, the same slightly upturned nose and the determined set of his mouth. There was even a tiny mole on his neck, in the exact same spot as Ethan's. Emily's hands shook as she enlarged the image, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. This couldn't be real. It was a trick of light, a product of her own desperate imagination. But the more she stared, the more certain she became. For the first time in years, the suffocating fog of despair began to lift, replaced by a wild, electrifying bolt of something she hadn't felt in forever. Hope. She felt an overwhelming instinctual pull, a voice in her soul screaming, "That's him! That's my son!" The school bell rang, signalling the end of her break, but she didn't hear it. The world had shrunk to the size of her computer screen. "Ethan, you need to see this. Now!" Her voice was breathless, frantic. When he answered his phone at the construction site, he heard the urgency and the underlying tremor of something other than sadness, something new. "What is it, Em?" "Is everything okay?" he asked, his mind immediately jumping to the worst. "Just look at what I sent you," she urged. He pulled up the email, squinting at his phone screen in the bright afternoon sun, and then he saw it. He saw himself. A jolt went through him, a strange mix of disbelief and a chilling sense of déjà vu. "Who is this?" he asked, his voice low. "His name is Leo. He's in a children's home in Joliet," Emily said, words tumbling out. "Ethan, look at him. It's a sign. It has to be." Ethan was a man of logic, of blueprints and stress calculations. He didn't believe in signs. But staring at the face of this unknown boy, a mirror of his own forgotten childhood, he felt the rigid structures of his world begin to shift. "Okay," he said, the single word carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken emotions. "Okay, let's find out more." The next few weeks were a blur of organised chaos. They were suddenly propelled into the world of adoption, a place they had only ever discussed in hushed, painful tones. They filled out mountains of paperwork, their kitchen table disappearing under stacks of financial statements, personal essays, and medical histories. They submitted to background checks and fingerprinting, their lives laid bare for social workers to inspect. They attended the mandatory parenting classes, sitting in a sterile community centre room, with other hopeful couples, learning about trauma-informed care and attachment theory. For Emily, it was invigorating. Every form signed, every class attended, was a step closer to Leo. For Ethan, it was more complex. The process forced him to dredge up memories he had spent a lifetime suppressing. Answering questions about his own family, his own upbringing, felt like walking barefoot over broken glass. He could feel the locked door to his past beginning to rattle on its hinges. One night, after a particularly grueling session of filling out a family history questionnaire, Ethan couldn't sleep. He sat in the dark living room, the pale blue light of a street lamp striping the floor. Emily found him there, a silhouette of tension. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly, sitting beside him on the couch. He was silent for a long time. Then the dam broke. "I had a sister," he began, his voice rough. "Her name was Vicky. She was 2 years older than me." Emily listened, breathless, as he finally unlocked the door. He spoke of a childhood spent in grimy apartments and trailer parks, of a mother lost in the fog of alcoholism, and of a bond with his sister that was their only anchor in a sea of chaos. He told her how Vicky was a storyteller, a little magician who could weave tales of wonder out of their bleak reality. She was his protector, his only real family. And then he told her about Frank. Frank was their mother's new boyfriend, a man with a short temper and cold, hard eyes. He brought a semblance of stability. There was always food now, the rent was always paid, but he also brought a heavy, suffocating fear into their small world. Ethan described how Frank despised Vicky's imaginative spirit, calling her slow and stupid because she struggled to read under his angry, impatient tutoring. "She wasn't stupid," Ethan said, his voice thick with a 30-year-old rage. "She was scared of him. He yelled he'd smack the back of her head. Of course she couldn't learn." He recounted how Frank convinced their mother that Vicky was a lost cause, and that they couldn't take her with them when they moved to a new city for Frank's job. The decision was made to put her into the system, to abandon her. The pain in his voice was so raw, it felt like it had happened yesterday, not a lifetime ago. The last memory was the sharpest. It was Vicky's 7th birthday. Ethan had saved up change from collecting empty cans and bought her a small, cheap burgundy plastic airplane from a corner store. It was the only present she had ever received. "She loved it," Ethan whispered, staring at his hands. "She tied a shoelace through it and wore it like a necklace. She said it was the plane from her favourite story, that it would fly her away to a better place one day." He then described the final terrible day. Their mother taking Vicky to a grey imposing building. The promise he made to his crying sister, that he would come for her, that they would be together. A promise he was forced to break. He was just a little boy, powerless against the adults who ripped his world in two. He tried to find her years later, but the trail was cold. She had been moved, her name possibly changed. She was gone. By the time he finished, dawn was breaking, and Emily was weeping silently, not for herself anymore, but for the little boy her husband had been, and for the sister he had lost. The drive to Joliet was thick with unspoken tension. The sky was a flat, overcast grey. Emily kept glancing at Ethan, whose hands were clenched white on the steering wheel. Was this a mistake? Were they chasing a ghost, projecting their hopes onto a random child who just happened to look like him? The children's home was a modern, low-slung, brick building that tried its best to look cheerful, with brightly painted murals on the walls. Inside, it smelled of disinfectant and cinnamon from a nearby kitchen. A kind-faced social worker named Maria led them to a large playroom, filled with colourful toys and sunlight from a large window. "Leo can be a little reserved at first," she warned gently. "He's been through a lot." Then the door opened and Leo walked in. He was smaller than he looked in the pictures, a frail-looking boy with a nervous energy. He stopped just inside the door, his big, serious eyes taking them in. The photo hadn't lied. It was like looking at a miniature Ethan. Silence stretched. Leo clutched the hem of his t-shirt, looking from Emily to Ethan and back again. Ethan felt his throat tighten. He saw his sister in the boy's delicate features, in the slight tilt of his head. He knelt down slowly so as not to frighten him. "Hi, Leo," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "I'm Ethan. This is Emily." Leo didn't respond. He just stared at Ethan, his gaze intense, searching. Then a slow, shy smile spread across his face, and with it, 2 perfect dimples appeared on his cheeks. They were Vicky's dimples. Ethan felt a jolt, a current of recognition so powerful it almost knocked him over. In that moment, all his logic and reason evaporated. He wasn't looking at a coincidence. He was looking at a connection. Emily, seeing the look on her husband's face and the boy's hesitant smile, felt tears well in her eyes. This was right. This was their son. Maria, the social worker, watched the quiet interaction with a knowing smile. "You know, it's funny," she said, her voice soft. "We've had several families interested in Leo. He's a wonderful kid, bright and sweet, but he's pushed them all away. Every single one." She explained that with other potential parents, Leo would become withdrawn, sometimes even throwing a tantrum, a defense mechanism he had developed to control a world that had so often been out of his control. "He told me he was waiting," Maria continued, looking at Leo, who was now cautiously taking a small step toward Ethan. "He said he would know his real family when he saw them." Emily's heart swelled. She looked at this small boy who had been waiting for them, just as they had been unknowingly searching for him. The broken pieces of their life and the broken pieces of his seemed to be slowly, miraculously clicking into place. The day they brought Leo home was the best day of their lives. He walked into their little bungalow with a wide-eyed wonder that made everything feel new again. He ran his small hand along the living room wall, touched the leaves of a houseplant, and peered into every room. When Emily showed him his own room, the one that had been a monument to their grief for so long, his face lit up. She had filled it with everything a little boy could want. A bed shaped like a race car, a bookshelf brimming with stories, and a large mural of a starry galaxy on the wall. He stood in the centre of the room, turning in a slow circle, taking it all in. "This is all for me?" he asked, his voice a tiny whisper. "All for you, sweetheart," Emily said, her own voice choked with emotion. He wasn't just filling a room. He was filling the vast, empty space in their hearts. That night, their house was no longer silent. It was filled with the soft sounds of a child breathing in the next room. As Emily was tucking him into his new race car bed, she noticed the little object hanging from a worn shoelace around his neck. It was a small, burgundy plastic airplane, its colour faded from years of being held. "What's this?" she asked gently, touching the toy. Leo's hand immediately went to it, protective. "It's my talisman," he said seriously. "My mom gave it to me. She said it keeps me safe." Emily's heart ached for the mother he had lost, a woman who had clearly loved him very much. She smiled. "Well, it's a very special talisman." Later, after Leo was asleep, she mentioned it to Ethan. "He wears the sweetest little airplane necklace. He said his mum gave it to him." Ethan, who was reading in the living room, slowly lowered his book. A cold dread mingled with a wild, impossible hope washed over him. "What? What did it look like?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. As Emily described the cheap plastic burgundy toy, the world tilted on its axis. It couldn't be. It was a common, cheap toy from decades ago. There must have been millions of them made. It was just another cruel coincidence, a trick of a grieving mind desperate to find patterns. But the image was burned into his memory. The exact shade of burgundy, the specific shape of the wings. He had to know. The next day, while Emily was at work and Leo was engrossed in a cartoon, Ethan quietly went into his son's room. The airplane was on the nightstand, where Leo had placed it before his bath. Ethan picked it up. His hands were large and calloused, but he held the tiny toy with a surgeon's delicacy. He turned it over. On the underside of one wing, nearly worn away, was a tiny, barely visible scratch. A scratch he had made himself with a safety pin on that long-ago afternoon in the corner store, to make it his before giving it to Vicky. His breath left him in a rush. It was the same one. It wasn't just a toy. It was a message from the past. Who was Leo's mother? The adoption file was sealed for privacy, but they knew the basics. Her name was Victoria. She had grown up in the foster care system herself. She was a single mother who worked as a cook in a college cafeteria. She had died in a tragic car accident, hit by a drunk driver just a year ago. Victoria. Vicky. The name echoed in Ethan's mind. Could it really be her? His lost sister? The quiet, imaginative girl who told stories about the stars? The one he had promised to save? If Leo was her son, it meant that Vicky had survived. She had grown up. She had lived. She had loved this little boy with all her heart. But it also meant she was gone forever. Her life cut short before he could ever find her, before he could apologize for breaking his promise. The hope and grief were so intertwined. It was impossible to separate them. He was a father, and he was beginning to suspect an uncle. Life with Leo was a journey of discovery. He was a funny, thoughtful, and incredibly bright child. He loved to draw, filling pages with fantastical creatures and detailed worlds. He was a voracious reader, devouring the books on his shelves and asking for more. And just like Vicky, he was a storyteller. He would sit at the dinner table and spin elaborate tales about the squirrels in the backyard or the adventures of a lonely firefly. Emily, an elementary school teacher, was in heaven. She carefully wrote down each of his stories in a thick notebook, treasuring every word. Ethan watched him mesmerized. He saw his sister in Leo's every gesture, the way he'd scrunch up his nose when he was concentrating, the way his hands would fly about as he described an exciting part of a story. It was both beautiful and agonizing. He was getting to know his sister again, through her son, a bittersweet gift from a fate he couldn't comprehend. Ethan decided he needed definitive proof. The scratch on the toy was compelling, but it wasn't enough for a man who dealt in facts. He started quietly putting money aside. For a DNA test, he told Emily one night, a paternal lineage test, between me and Leo, to see if we're related. Emily looked at him, her expression soft. Do you really need a piece of paper to tell you what you already feel in your heart? She asked. I need to know, Em, he insisted. I need to know for sure. For her. The plan was set. He took on extra side projects, working late into the night, the savings account for the test growing slowly but steadily. He felt a desperate need for certainty, a need to give a name to the ghost that walked the halls of their happy home. He needed to know if he had failed his sister completely, or if this little boy was his one, final chance at redemption. As the months passed, Leo blossomed. The nervous, frail boy who had walked into their lives was replaced by a confident, happy kid with a quick laugh. He made friends at school, joined the local soccer team, and filled their quiet bungalow with a joyful noise they had only ever dreamed of. He and Ethan developed a special bond. They would spend hours in the garage building intricate model airplanes, a hobby Ethan had picked up as a way to feel close to his sister's memory. Leo, with his nimble fingers and vivid imagination, was unnatural. One afternoon, while they were painting a model of a vintage propeller plane, Leo looked up at Ethan. My mom liked airplanes too, he said quietly. She said they could take you anywhere you wanted to go, even to the stars. Ethan's hand stilled, a drop of silver paint falling onto the workbench. She sounds like she was a wonderful person, Ethan managed to say, his voice thick. The day of Emily's birthday arrived, a bright, sunny morning in early June. They were planning a small celebration, just the three of them, with cake and a trip to the zoo. As Emily and Ethan were having coffee in the kitchen, Leo walked in ceremoniously, holding a large piece of drawing paper behind his back. I made you a present, Mom, he announced, his face glowing with pride. He presented it to her with a flourish. It was a beautiful, vibrant drawing, full of colour and life. It depicted two children. One was a boy who seemed to be made of golden light, with rays shining from his hair. The other was a girl with fiery red hair, laughing so hard her eyes were squeezed shut. They were holding hands on top of a fluffy white cloud. It's beautiful, honey. Who are they? Emily asked, pulling him into a hug. Ethan looked over her shoulder at the drawing, and the coffee mug in his hand began to tremble. He recognized them instantly. That's Sunbeam Boy, Leo explained, pointing to the golden child. And that's Giggle Girl. They're brother and sister, and they live in the clouds and have adventures. Emily smiled, charmed by his imagination. What a wonderful story, sweetie. Did you make it up? But Ethan wasn't listening to her. He was frozen, staring at the drawing. Sunbeam Boy and Giggle Girl. The names echoed across a 30-year chasm of time. It was Vicky's story. It was their story. She had created the characters for them, a brother and sister who were safe and happy in a magical world, so far from their own grim reality. He had been her Sunbeam Boy. She had been his Giggle Girl. It was a secret language only the two of them had ever known. The air left his lungs and he had to grip the back of a chair to steady himself. No, I didn't make it up, Leo said, shaking his head. My mom did. She used to tell me stories about them all the time before I went to sleep. He looked from his drawing to Ethan's pale, shocked face. She said Sunbeam Boy was brave and kind, and he always protected his sister, no matter what. The little boy's innocent words were the final, irrefutable proof. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a guess. This was a story passed from a mother to her son, a legacy of love that had survived orphanages and separation and even death. It was Vicky, reaching out from the past, telling him she remembered, telling him it was real. Leo was her son. He was Ethan's nephew. Emily looked from the drawing to her husband's face, and in his tear-filled eyes she finally understood the full, staggering truth of the miracle that had brought this little boy into their lives. Later that day, after the cake had been eaten and the wrapping paper cleared away, Ethan sat at his computer. He pulled up the online banking page and looked at the account he had labelled DNA test. There was enough money in it now. He could make the appointment tomorrow, get the sterile kit, swab their cheeks, and receive a piece of paper that would confirm everything. He looked out the window at the backyard. Leo was chasing a butterfly across the lawn, his laughter carrying on the summer breeze. Emily was watching him from the porch, a look of pure, unadulterated happiness on her face. What would a piece of paper prove that a child's drawing and a mother's story hadn't already? The truth wasn't in a laboratory. It was right here, in their home, in their hearts. He didn't need scientific proof. He needed to be a father to this boy. He needed to honour his sister's memory by giving her son the happy, safe childhood she never had. He closed the banking website and opened a new tab. He began searching for flights to Florida, for beachfront cottages, and theme park tickets. A moment later, he walked out onto the porch and sat beside Emily. I have an idea, he said, a real, genuine smile, reaching his eyes for the first time in what felt like years. What do you guys think about a trip to the ocean for our summer vacation? Leo, hearing the word ocean, let out a whoop of joy and ran over. Really, Dad? The real ocean? He asked, his eyes wide with excitement. The real ocean, Ethan confirmed, ruffling his hair. Emily looked at him, her eyes questioning. What about the test? She whispered so Leo couldn't hear. Ethan just shook his head, taking her hand. We don't need it, he said, his voice firm with a newfound peace. I know who he is. He's our son. Ethan finally understood. He hadn't been able to save his sister all those years ago. That failure, that guilt, had been a shadow he carried his entire life. But fate, in its own mysterious and heartbreaking way, had given him a second chance. It had sent him Vicky's greatest creation, her most precious story, her son. He couldn't go back and change the past. He couldn't erase the pain and the loss. But he could build a new future. He could be the protector for Leo that he had always wanted to be for Vicky. He could fill this boy's life with so much love and laughter that it would honour her memory more than any tears or regrets ever could. As he watched Leo describe the giant sandcastles he was going to build, Ethan felt the heavy weight he had carried for 30 years finally begin to lift. He was no longer just a man who built bridges of concrete and steel. He was a man building a bridge back to his own heart. The house in Berwyn was no longer silent. It was a place of controlled chaos, of Lego bricks on the floor and crayon drawings on the fridge. The yellow nursery was now Leo's room, a vibrant hub of imagination and adventure. Ethan and Emily had wanted a child to complete their family, to fill a void in their lives. They had gotten so much more. They had gotten a link to a lost past, a story of survival, and the love that transcended blood and time. They had become a family not just by choice, but by a destiny that had been set in motion decades ago, with a shared story between a brother and a sister in a dark, lonely room. They were three broken pieces who, against all odds, had found each other and become whole. They were Sunbeam Boy and Giggle Girl's legacy, and the teacher who had brought them all together. One evening, Ethan found an old, dusty photo album while cleaning out a closet. Tucked in the back was a faded Polaroid, the only picture he had of himself and Vicky together. He was about 5, she was 7. They were standing in front of a chain-link fence, two skinny kids with serious eyes. And there, around her neck, was the small burgundy airplane. He brought the photo to Leo, who was drawing at the kitchen table. "Look," he said softly. "This was me, and this was my sister, Vicky." Leo looked at the photo, then up at Ethan. He pointed a small finger at the girl. "She looks like the Giggle Girl," he said with certainty. "Yeah," Ethan replied, a lump forming in his throat. "She really does." He knew now that Vicky's stories hadn't just been for him. They were for her son too. A breadcrumb trail of love, left behind for him to follow, leading him right where he was always meant to be. That summer, they stood on a beach in Florida, the warm Atlantic waves washing over their ankles. The air smelled of salt and sunscreen. Leo, who had never seen the ocean before, was speechless with awe. Ethan watched his son, his nephew, run toward the water with pure, uninhibited joy. He thought of Vicky, and for the first time, the memory didn't bring a sharp stab of pain, but a gentle, bittersweet warmth. He imagined her there with them, smiling. He hadn't been able to give her the world he had promised, but he was giving it to her son. Emily came and stood beside him, slipping her hand into his. "She would be so proud of you, Ethan," she said, as if reading his mind. He looked at her, at the woman whose unwavering love had made all of this possible, and then at the little boy splashing in the surf. He was home. They were all finally home. In the end, Ethan never needed a DNA test. The proof was in a child's drawing, in a faded plastic toy, and in a story whispered from a mother to her son. The incredible coincidence that brought Leo into their lives was no coincidence at all. It was the final chapter of a story his sister Vicky had started writing decades ago, a story of a brother's love, a mother's hope, and the unbreakable bonds that not even time and tragedy can sever. Ethan couldn't undo the past, but by becoming a father to his nephew, he gave his sister the one thing he always promised her, a happy ending for her family. He healed his own heart by building a future for the son of the sister he could never forget. Thank you so much for watching this incredible story with us. If it touched your heart, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe for more powerful stories, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever experienced a coincidence that felt like it was something more, something like fate? Let us know.